In the winter of 1898, a man was found frozen solid in a seated position near the Chilkoot Pass, his hand still gripping a map that promised a valley of gold. Of the 500 men who followed that map into the heart of the Yukon, only 7 returned to tell a story that the world refused to believe. This is the documented survival of the Lost 500, a descent into a white hell where the temperature dropped so low that metal shattered like glass, and men were forced to weigh the price of a human soul against a single scrap of dry wood. The Klondike Gold Rush was a fever that turned the American West into a breeding ground for desperate dreams. By 1898, the easy gold in the creeks was gone, but rumors persisted of a frozen vein, a hidden valley on the Alaskan-Yukon border where nuggets the size of hen's eggs sat atop the permafrost. A well-funded syndicate of 486 men, led by a disgraced civil engineer named Elias Thorne, decided to bypass the crowded trails and carve a new path through the unmapped St. Elias Mountains. They carried 40,000 pounds of high-end equipment, steam-powered drills, experimental kerosene heaters, and enough cured salt pork to last 2 winters. They thought they had conquered nature with capital and iron. They were wrong. The ascent began in late October, a month when the Alaskan wilderness begins its slow transition into a tomb. The Chilkoot Pass was already a bottleneck of misery, but Thorne's group pushed further north into the dead zones where even the Tlingit guides refused to go. Within the first 10 days, the sheer verticality of the ice began to claim its toll. Men climbed the same 1,000-foot slopes 40 times over, ferrying their gear in agonizing relays. Each breath felt like swallowing a mouthful of needles. The horses were the first to go. Their lungs simply froze mid-stride, and they collapsed like heavy statues. The men didn't mourn them. They butchered them while the meat was still warm enough to cut, desperate for any fat to fuel their shivering bodies. By November, the sun became a pale, distant memory, appearing for only 3 hours a day before sinking behind the jagged peaks. Then came the black blizzard. It wasn't a storm of flakes, but a wall of crystalline ice shards driven by 90-mile-per-hour winds. In the chaos of the first night, the main supply cache, the 40,000 pounds of survival, was buried under a massive dry snow avalanche. In an instant, the syndicate went from being the best-equipped expedition in history to a collection of starving beggars. They were left with nothing but the clothes on their backs, a few rifles, and 3 crates of hardtack. The nearest human outpost was 300 miles of vertical ice away. Thorne realized that traditional camping was suicide. He ordered the men to dig. They became human moles, carving snow cathedrals deep into the drifts, using the snow's own density to insulate against the -60-degree air above. Inside these blue-tinted burrows, the silence was deafening. It was here that the psychological rot began. Without the sun, the mind loses its anchor to reality. Men began to hear music in the wind, violins playing folk songs from their homes in Ohio or New York. Others claimed the mountains were moving, closing in to crush them. Hunger changed from a physical pain into a spiritual void. They boiled their leather boots until they were soft enough to chew, the bitter tan of the hide making their tongues swell and bleed. On December 15th, the group reached a breaking point. A faction of 200 men, driven mad by the Arctic burn, decided to make a break for the coast in the middle of a whiteout. Thorne pleaded with them, knowing the valley they were in was a topographical trap. They left anyway, their figures disappearing into the swirling white mist within seconds. They were never seen again. The remaining survivors huddled in the dark, listening to the rhythmic thump-thump of their own slowing hearts. Just as the last of their candles flickered out, Thorne's lead scout crawled back into the burrow with a terrifying discovery. They weren't just dying of cold. They had accidentally stumbled into an ancient, prehistoric graveyard of mammoths preserved in the ice, and something else was already there, scavenging the remains. The discovery of the Mammoth Graveyard beneath the ice changed the mission from a search for gold to a primal struggle for calories. The mammoth meat, preserved for 12,000 years in the Alaskan permafrost, was black and tasted like ancient oily dirt, but to the remaining 200 men, it was the only thing keeping their internal fires burning. They hacked at the carcasses with dull axes, the sound of steel hitting frozen flesh echoing through the blue-lit ice caves like the tolling of a funeral bell. But as they ate, they realized they were being watched. The something else that the scout had seen was not a beast of the forest, but a pack of dire wolves, descendants of a lineage thought extinct, massive creatures with eyes that reflected the aurora borealis in shades of unnatural violet. By mid-January, the temperature plunged to a record negative 75 degrees Fahrenheit. At this depth of cold, the liquid in a human eye can freeze if one stares into the wind for too long. Elias Thorne's leadership was fraying. The men were no longer an expedition, they were a cult of the cold. They spent 18 hours a day huddled in a circle, sharing the warmth of their bodies, while the wolves sat at the mouth of the snow tunnels, waiting. The wolves didn't attack, they simply waited for a man to grow weak enough to stop shivering. In the Arctic, shivering is the only thing that proves you are still alive. Once you stop, you belong to the frost. The psychological pressure of the Valley of Whispers began to claim more lives than the frost. The valley's unique geography created an acoustic anomaly. The wind rushing through the jagged granite spires sounded like human voices, screaming, pleading, or calling the men by their names. One by one, men would stand up, glassy-eyed, and walk out into the blizzard, convinced they heard their wives or mothers calling from just over the next ridge. Thorne tried to tie the men together with climbing ropes to prevent these walk-offs, but the ropes grew brittle and snapped like dry twigs in the extreme cold. On January 28th, they found the first golden statue. It wasn't a nugget of gold, but a man from the group that had left in December. He was standing perfectly upright, frozen mid-step, encased in a 3-inch layer of clear ice. He looked like a masterpiece in a gallery of horrors. As they looked closer, they saw he was holding something, not a tool, but a handful of the very gold they had come for. The frozen vein was real. The ground beneath their feet was littered with it, but in the shadow of the wolves and the -70-degree wind, the gold was as worthless as the stones in a cemetery. The hunger eventually drove them to the ultimate taboo.
When the mammoth meat ran out and the wolves picked off the stragglers, the men turned their eyes toward the statues, the frozen bodies of their comrades. Thorn, his own toes black with gangrene, tried to maintain the last vestiges of civilization. He declared that anyone who touched the dead would be exiled into the storm. But the hunger of the Arctic is not a moral force. It is a biological fire that consumes everything. By the first week of February, the camp had split into those who would rather die than lose their humanity, and those who were willing to do anything to see the sun again. Just as the internal war was about to turn into a massacre, the earth itself began to groan. The weight of the unprecedented snowpack, combined with a sudden seismic shift, triggered a massive icequake. The floor of the valley split open, revealing a hidden volcanic vent that hissed with sulfurous steam. For the first time in months, there was heat. But the heat brought a new terror. The melting ice was releasing gases that had been trapped for millennia, and the hallucinations were about to become physical. The survivors were now trapped between a freezing hell and a boiling, poisonous labyrinth, with the wolves closing in for the final kill.
The opening of the volcanic vent was both a salvation and a curse. While the sulfurous steam provided a localized pocket of warmth that stopped the men's blood from turning to slush, the thick, yellowish mist that rose from the earth's bowels carried more than just heat. It carried ancient gases, vestiges of a world that existed before the ice. As the survivors inhaled the fumes, the line between reality and the nightmare blurred. The dire wolves which had been circling the perimeter for weeks now seemed to stand 8 feet tall, their shadows stretching across the ice like elongated demons. Elias Thorne, his mind fractured by hunger and the constant hum of the earth, realized that the heat was melting the very foundation of their snow sanctuary. The snow cathedrals were turning into water graves. By mid-February, of the original 486 men, only 23 remained within the circle of the steam vent. The rest had either walked into the white void, been claimed by the wolves, or succumbed to the deep sleep of hypothermia. The gold they had sought, the frozen vein, was now visible as the ice floor retreated. Massive veins of quartz, choked with raw, crystalline gold, glittered in the dark. But none of the 23 men looked at it. Gold cannot be breathed, and it cannot be burned. They were surrounded by a fortune that could buy a kingdom, yet they were fighting over the charred scraps of a leather boot. Thorne sat by the edge of the vent, his hands wrapped in rags, watching the steam rise. He knew the vent was a temporary anomaly. Once the pressure equalized, the heat would vanish, and the frost would return with a vengeance, fueled by the moisture they were now breathing. "We have to move tonight," Thorne croaked, his voice sounding like 2 stones grinding together. "If we stay here, the steam will settle on our skin as ice. We will be encased in a tomb of our own sweat." The descent from the Valley of Whispers was a journey into the mouth of madness. The group carried no gold, only their rifles and a single tattered American flag that Thorne refused to leave behind. They used the volcanic heat to soften the frozen mammoth hides they had scavenged, wrapping them around their bodies until they looked like primitive beasts of the Pleistocene. As they climbed out of the valley, the wolves made their final move.
It wasn't a coordinated strike, but a relentless attrition. Every time a man stumbled, every time a lung gave out under the strain of the thin, freezing air, the violet-eyed pack was there. By the time they reached the frozen banks of the Yukon River, only 12 men were left. The Yukon was a highway of jagged ice pressure ridges. They had to navigate a labyrinth of frozen waves some 30 feet high. It was here that the true survival instinct took its darkest turn. The group ran out of the last mammoth scraps. For 3 days they ate nothing but snow and the bark of stunted willow trees they found near the riverbank. On the 4th day, Silas Vane, a young man from Maine who had been the expedition's strongest climber, collapsed. He didn't die immediately. He simply stopped moving. The 11 remaining men stood over him in a silent circle. No one spoke. The hunger was no longer a feeling. It was a physical presence, a third party in their group. That night, the first act of true cannibalism occurred. It was done in total silence, with the shame of it buried under the primal necessity of the heart's beat. By the time the first signs of the March thaw appeared, the 12 had become 7. Elias Thorne, Silas Vane's brother Thomas, and 5 others whose names would later be stricken from the official record of the Northern Star Syndicate. They were no longer the men who had left Seattle with 40,000 pounds of gear. They were skeletal wraiths, their skin stretched tight over bone, their eyes sunk so deep into their skulls that they looked like empty sockets. They reached the outskirts of a small Flinkit fishing village on the coast of the Lynn Canal on March 22, 1998. The villagers, seeing these 7 creatures emerging from the white mist, initially thought they were Kushtaka, the mythical land otter men who steal the souls of those lost at sea. When the 7 survivors were finally brought back to Seattle, the story they told was so horrific that the syndicate's investors spent thousands of dollars to suppress it. The public wanted stories of heroic gold seekers, not tales of mammoth-eating cannibals and prehistoric wolves. Thorne was offered a fortune to keep the frozen vein a secret, to prevent a second wave of men from rushing into that certain death. He took the money, but he never spent a cent of it. He lived the rest of his life in a small shack in the woods of Washington State, never touching metal, never lighting a fire, and never speaking another word until his death in 1924. The Lost 500 became a footnote in the history of the Klondike Gold Rush, a cautionary tale whispered by old-timers in the saloons of Dawson County. The gold still sits in that valley, guarded by the ghosts of 479 men and the violet-eyed wolves that still howl when the temperature drops to -70. The American dream of wealth had met the American reality of the frontier, and the frontier had won. Only the 7 survivors knew the true price of survival, and they carried that secret to their graves, leaving behind only a tattered flag and a diary filled with the names of the dead, written in frozen blood.